it's time for chapter 12. They were in the kitchen now, and the big saucepan was on the stove. All the things Mr. Cranky had brought were lined up near the sink. "Come along, my boy," cried Mr. Killy Cranky. "Which one did you put in first?" "This one," George said. "Golden Gloss hair shampoo." He emptied the bottle into the pan. "Now the toothpaste," George went on, "and the shaving foam, and the face cream, and the nail varnish." "Keep at it, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky, dancing round the kitchen. "Keep putting them all in. Don't stop, don't pause, don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you work." One by one, George poured and squeezed the things into the saucepan. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But when it was all done, the saucepan didn't somehow seem to be quite as full as it had been the first time. "Now what did you do?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Did you stir it?" "I boiled it," George said, "but not for long, and I stirred it as well." So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the saucepan, and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon he'd used before. "It's not brown enough," George said. "Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten." "What?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Tell me, quick! Because if we've forgotten one tiny thing, then it won't work, at least not in the same way." "A quart of brown gloss paint," George said. "That's what I've forgotten." Mr. Killy Cranky shot out of the house and into his car like a rocket. He sped down to the village and brought the paint and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the saucepan. "Ah, that's better," George said. "That's looking like the right colour." "It's boiling," cried Mr. Cranky. "It's boiling, it's bubbling, George! Is it ready yet?" "It's ready," George said. "At least I hope it is." "Right!" shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. "Let's test it. Let's give it to a chicken." "My heavens alive! Why don't you calm down a bit?" Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. "Calm down?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Do you expect me to calm down? When we are mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world. Come along, George, dip a cupful out of the saucepan and get a spoon. We'll give some to a chicken just to make sure, absolutely certain, we've got the correct mixture." Outside in the yard there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's marvellous medicine number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt in that silly way that chickens do. George crouched down, holding out a spoonful of marvellous medicine number 2. "Come on, chicken," he said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chicken." A white chicken with black specks on its feathers looked up at George. It walked over to the spoon and went peck. The effect that medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by the magic number 1, but it was very interesting. "Whoosh!" shrieked the chicken, and it shot up 6 feet in the air and came back down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak, bright sparks of yellow fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but 2 thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer and longer still. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Killy Cranky. "Something's wrong," George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher in the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd with its long legs and then its ordinary little body perched up on high at top. It was like a chicken on stilts. "Oh, my sated aunts!" cried Mr. Killy Cranky. "We've got it wrong. This chicken's no good to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken legs." "I must have left something out," George said. "I know you left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What was it that you left out?" "I've got it," said George. "What was it? Quick." "Flea powder for dogs," George said. "You mean you put flea powder in the first one?" "Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it." "Then that's the answer." "Wait a minute," said George. "Did we have our brown shoe polish on our list?" "We did not," said Mr. Cranky. "I used that too," said George. "Well, no wonder it went wrong," Mr. Cranky said. He was already running to his car, and soon he was heading down to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish. Chapter 13. Marvellous Medicine number 3. "Here it is," cried Mr. Killiecranky, rushing into our kitchen. "1 carton of flea powder for dogs and 1 tin of brown shoe polish." George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan. Then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin and added that as well. "Stir it up, George," shouted Mr. Cranky. "Give it another boil. We've got it this time. I bet we've got it." After Marvellous Medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a cupful of it out into the yard to try on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. "Come and watch this one," he called out to Mrs. Cranky. "Come and watch us turning an ordinary chicken into a lovely big one that lays eggs as large as footballs." "I hope you do better than the last time," says Mrs. Cranky, following them out. "Come on, chicken," said George, holding a spoonful of magic medicine number 3. "Good, chicken. Chick, 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 chicken. Have some lovely medicine." A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The cockerel looked at the spoon and went, peck. "Cock-a-doodle!" squawked the cockerel, shooting up into the air and coming down again. "Watch him now," cried Mr. Cranky. "Watch him grow. Any minute he's going to start growing bigger and bigger." Mr. Killiecranky, Mrs. Cranky and George stood in the yard staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as if it had a headache. "What's happening to its neck?" Mrs. Cranky said. "It's getting longer," George said. "I'll say it's getting longer," Mrs. Cranky said. Mr. Cranky, for once, said nothing. "Last time it was the legs," Mrs. Cranky said. "Now it's the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat chicken's neck." It really was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body hadn't grown at all, but the neck was now around 6 feet long. "All right, George," Mr. Cranky said. "What else have we forgotten?" "I don't know," said George. "Oh, yes, you do," Mr. Cranky said. "Come along, boy, think. There's probably just one vital thing you're missing, and you've got to remember it." "I put in some engine oil from the garage," George said. "Did you have that on your list?" "Eureka!" cried Mr. Cranky. "That's the answer. How much did you put in?" "About half a pint," George said. Mr. Cranky ran to the garage and found another pint of oil. "And some antifreeze," George called after him. "I sloshed a bit of antifreeze in too." Night-night.